Is it okay to say that I struggle in my relationship with Hashem, and moments where I feel God's presence, and moments where I really have doubts or questions or a sense of distance?
Hi, my name is Rafi Shamel, and today we are joined with Raizi Chechik.
My name is Raizi Chechik, and I've had the pleasure of being involved in Jewish education for almost 3 decades now, and I also work as a community scholar in adult education. What I'd love to do is approach our conversation today, what the research tells us about children and spirituality. And I would say that the doyen of research on children and spirituality is a professor named Lisa Miller, who is a professor at Teachers College of Columbia University, and she writes that when she began her research on children and spirituality, there was sort of pushback in the academic community as to what is spirituality, right? It's not a science, but what is spirituality? And she came up with a definition that I really like and I'd love to use for purposes of our conversation today. Her definition is as follows. Spirituality is an inner sense of a lived connection to a higher power that is loving and guiding. And what is fascinating is that the research indicates that children are born with an almost fully developed capacity for this spirituality. Cognitive functions are, emergent. Functions of mobility are months and years away. Receptive and expressive language, months and years away. But this awareness that there is something above, transcendent and loving is inborn. And the same way a tiny infant placed on its mother's abdomen will know to root upward for nourishment and sustenance, children are born with this awareness. We can ruin it, but it is something innate. So we know that children are born with a powerfully, almost fully developed spiritual sense. And I would say what's even more significant in the research is the tremendous benefit accrued to children when we develop this spirituality. And there are reams of research on this. I'm going to cite 3 statistics. When we cultivate spirituality in children, they are 40% less likely to engage in alcohol or substance abuse as young adults. They are 60% less likely to experience anxiety or depression as adolescents or young adults. And as we all know, that depression and anxiety for the last decade have been a scourge of adolescents and young adults at rates we've never seen before. And they are 80% less likely to engage in unsafe practices in their personal relationships. So that the benefits in every area of life, the research indicates, a sense of self, relationships, even professionally and academically, are such that when spirituality is cultivated, a child experiences tremendous benefit. It's fascinating that in a mirror image, the adult doing the cultivating experiences a lot of these benefits as well.
What does it look like for a child that has this spirituality cultivated?
The single greatest tool that seems to emerge from the research for cultivating this innate spirituality is talking about God in the here and in the now. So not just God of the Chumash, of the Bible, of the past, of Jewish history, of the Siddur, but talking about God in our lives. The research is really strong on this. So, when I light Shabbat candles, I ask God to give you a good week ahead. When Aunt Cecilia is in the hospital, I ask God to give her a complete and speedy recovery. When we travel and look at beautiful scenery, look at those magnificent mountains. What a wonderful world God has created. That talking about God and the here and the now, if you remember nothing else from this conversation, is the single greatest tool we can use to cultivate this spirituality that benefits children in truly every realm of their emerging adult lives.
So this God talk that you're mentioning of speaking about God in the here and now, do you see that echoed in Jewish sources?
Absolutely. As Jews, we sort of experience time, I would say, in the solar arc of the day and in the lunar arc of the year, right? And in the solar arc of the day, perhaps our epicentral moment of connection to God is the recitation of Shema. And think about how the Shema describes transmitting legacy to children. V'shinantam levanecha, you should teach your children, v'dibarta bam, and speak to them. Where? It doesn't say b'makom asher yivchar, right, in the ultimate, the temple, or the iterations in the modern world of the Bet Midrash, a synagogue or a study hall. It says b'shivtecha b'veitecha, right, when you're sitting at home around your table. B'lechtecha b'derech, when you're looking at God's beautiful world. B'shachvecha, in those quiet moments before bedtime when children are always like, can we have one more moment? B'kumecha, those halcyon moments before you rush into the bustle of the day, that's where we talk about God in the here and now.
And more important than doing it, say, in the ceremony of the Beit Midrash or the Beit Knesset.
So I think that certainly has its role. But, as I mentioned at the beginning, Judaism is a religion of praxis, of action, and also of belief. And I think in the realm of belief, it seems to be in these spaces where those messages, I think, and the research seems to indicate, are best transmitted.
So what are the obstacles that you've noticed that parents deal with when it comes to having God talk with their children, and how does a parent overcome them?
Absolutely. I love that question. And I would say it is not only Jewish parents who are hesitant or reticent, perhaps sometimes, about speaking to their children about God. There was a Barna research poll done a number of years back. It's an organization that sort of researches social and cultural trends in American religious life, where parents were called and interviewed with a series of 2 questions. Do you think it is your role to talk to your children about God? And a striking over 80% of American parents responded yes. The follow-up question was, how many of you have spoken to your children about God in the last week? And the response went down to under 20%. And I would say even that might be a slight exaggeration, because I think people tend to overportray the positive in these phone interviews. So why is it that we don't talk to our children about God? And I would say that across the board, most parents, grandparents, are comfortable talking to their children about ethics, be kind, be honest, act with integrity. We're comfortable speaking to our children about ritual to the extent that we practice it. Wear a kippah, this is how we dress, here's how we light candles. I think that the reason we don't speak about God is because most of us as adults, we struggle at times in our relationship with God. We have hesitations and questions and doubts, and we don't want to share those with our children, so we just shut the conversation down, at tremendous detriment to both our children and ourselves. Perhaps one of the strongest messages we can give our children is, I too struggle. Struggle is part of the journey, and I choose to live this life. And modeling that, I think, is a beautiful modeling for children. There's a lovely truism by an American novelist. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. Right? That question is built into faith. If I may, I'd love to share with you an informal poll I did among my students at Manhattan Day School. This is not from the research, but from my own experience, where as I was studying this, I went into every classroom from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade, asking them about their conception of God. Right? And the research indicates actually that most children, when asked, will say that they were not spoken to about God. They studied texts, but they weren't spoken to about their relationship with God. So I walked into a kindergarten class, and the children had just come back from an apple picking trip. It was prior to Rosh Hashanah. And I sat on the carpet with them, and I said to them, these 5-year-olds, tell me about Hashem. Tell me about God. And this beautiful little girl raised her hand, and she said, God is the one who puts the apples on all of the trees. And also, Ms. Chechik, I like your earrings. And I say that because to her, those were both on the same exact linear plane of absolute reality.
Just observations of the world.
Yes. I moved into a 1st grade class, and then I'll just do one other after this. And the children were preparing for their Siddur presentation. And I said to them, who is Hashem? And this little boy looked up at me with a combination of pity and contempt in his eyes. I can't believe they hired this woman to run our school and she doesn't know the answer to this most basic of questions. And he said to me, God is the creator of all living beings. And then he went back to his coloring. But as we moved through the grades, the questions and the answers became more nuanced. And I walked into an 8th grade girls' classroom, and I said, tell me about God. And I was not a God talker, right? This was not a typical question for me. And there was complete silence. In fact, I think the greatest silence I'd ever seen in that classroom. And the students looked at each other, and one brave, intrepid young woman raised her hand, and she said, is it okay to say that I struggle in my relationship with Hashem? And I have moments of tefillah where I feel deep connection, and moments where I really don't, and moments where I feel God's presence, and moments where I really have doubts or questions or a sense of distance. And I saw the immense relief on all of her peers' faces and gratitude. Like, thank you for articulating that question that we are also struggling with. And here's what I answered, right? I told her and the class about this idea that the opposite of faith is not doubt, but the opposite of faith is certainty. And I gave the following 3 brief anecdotes. I mentioned how Rabbi Welba, one of the great exponents of Musar of the prior generation, said there is no such thing as a heretical question. I shared a citation from Rabbi Cook, Avram Yitzchak Cook, also of the past generation, who worked so much with the emerging secular Zionists in the land of Israel with so much love. And he said that a struggling soul is a sign of a soul that's alive. It's the opposite of flatlining. That struggle is a sign of life. And I shared a beautiful story I heard from a student of Rav Lichtenstein, a former Rosh Yeshiva in Har Etzion, who told his students apparently one year on Erev Yom Kippur that I pray 3 times a day in the hope that once a year I will feel true connection in my tefillah. And by giving this permission to struggle, it was like opening the floodgates among these young women, and the most rich spiritual life emerged. So by giving room for the hesitation and the doubt, acknowledging that as part of the process, I think we allow for a really rich spirituality to emerge. And the caveat is, I don't believe we should inspire doubt in children that don't experience it. We don't need to ask a 6-year-old, have you heard about the Kierkegaard's the teleological suspension of the ethical and the fear and the trembling? I don't think we need to do that. But when children come to us, we can honor their hesitation and not brush it away, and acknowledge that it's part of the spiritual journey.
You spoke so far mainly about the benefits for children. Is there anything for the adults who are cultivating it within their children? Are there benefits, research?
Yes. I wish I had the same specificity of statistics to cite to you, but I will say that the research indicates tremendous correlate, almost mirror imagery of correlate to mental health benefits to parents who cultivate this spirituality in their children. Diminution of stress, diminution of anxiety, sense of belonging, that there's almost like this synergy going on between parent and child as this spirituality and spiritual hub is being cultivated.
So earlier you mentioned about God Talk as an effective tool of cultivating spirituality among children. Are there any other clear tools or advice you'd give to parents about cultivating spirituality?
Absolutely. So I would say in the research, again, God Talk would be the primary, but I'm going to suggest 3 others: joy, giving, and narrative, JGN. In terms of joy, so neuroscience posits that we remember what is encased in intense emotion. So you may not remember where you put your keys this morning, but you might remember your 3rd birthday party or the funeral of a loved one, right? That there's deep emotion. If we would like our children to retain legacy and tradition, it's really important that we think about how to make those experiences joyous. Rav Moshe Feinstein, a famous American rabbi of the prior generation as well, used to say we lost a generation of Jews because parents would come home and say, "It's schwer zu sein Yid," excuse my Yiddish, it's hard to be a Jew. We need to tell them it's sweet to be a Jew, it's beautiful to be a Jew, and to make that practice joyous for them. So I think that with young children, the schools and community tends to do a very good job making religious experiences joyous. Shabbat parties, plays for Sidurim and Chumashim. I think as children get older, we don't do as good of a job, and it's important to think about what it is we value and to make those experiences joyous experiences.
What would you suggest for making a joyous experience, say for a tween or teen? It's a difficult age.
So I had spoken to a parent once at a parent conference years back who was very nominally observant. He was a single parent, and he said, "I'm not sure what I do or don't believe, but I want my children to be happy. And Shabbat and holidays in our house are like a party. I hire a sushi chef for Shavuot. I make Shabbat like an epicenter in the community. It's so exciting to experience Shabbat afternoons in our household." And I looked at his children years later, and they were all deeply committed, not from any statements of faith made by a parent, but from a memory of religion being something that brought them joy and religious practice being something that brought them joy. So I think we all know our own, what might work in our own families, but to really put thought, even among adult children. You could have a married grown-up child, take them out for dinner on Rosh Chodesh, right? To think about ways to make religious practice encased in joy at any stage of life.
For our audience, is there anything, closing thoughts that you'd like to share with whoever's watching?
One of the most evocative Mishnayot, like statements in the Mishnah that I think about a lot, and that my impression of this Mishnah has transformed as my own life has developed, is a beautiful citation in the third parak of Pirkei Avot from Elisha ben Abuya. I actually believe it may be one of the only citations in the entire rabbinic corpus where Elisha ben Abuya is referred to by name and not as Acher, the other, right, the one who left the path. Amar Elisha ben Abuya, Halomed Katan, what we learn as a young child, Kidyo al Niar Chadash. It is like ink on fresh parchment. In the ancient world, parchment was an expensive commodity. Calfskin, sheepskin, goatskin. And if it wasn't being used for sacred purposes and it was being used for, say, a shopping list, we would etch something, and when we were done, use a pumice stone to erase it, and then make new etchings. So what we learn as a young child, it is like ink on fresh parchment. Halomed Zaken, what we learn as an adult, Kidyo al Niar Machuk. It is like ink on parchment that has already been erased many times. When I was younger, I understood this to mean that what really counts is what you learn when you're young, right? That's really the only opportunity. That always emerges from beneath the echoes and shadows of anything on top of it. As an older person, I look at this midrash in a more dual way, this Mishnah in a more dual way. What we learn as a young child is indeed like ink on fresh parchment and will always return later. But even as an older person, our heart is still parchment on which new thoughts and new learnings and new teachings can be etched, and it is never too late.
Thank you so much for the insightful conversation. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you for inviting me. Thank you.